Well, good morning. Oh, let's try that again. I know I maybe caught you off guard. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you all for coming and spending some time out of your very busy days to have what I think is perhaps among the most important conversations that we can have when we start talking about our boys, our sons, and what they need to be successful in our communities. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here for this conversation. A few things that we can agree to as we have this conversation. One is that whenever you talk about school and race and inequity and challenges, that can evoke a lot of strong emotions in folks, and that can create sometimes some tension when you kind of have these kind of conversations. I want us to try to embrace that and to understand that we have different lenses that we see these things through, and that part of this hopefully conversation will help us understand our own lenses that we understand these circumstances through. To that end, let's do our best to try to be respectful and understanding that some folks may have things that they want to say that they may not know how to say it really well, right? And then they may say it very inartfully. Let's make this a safe space so that we can express what we're thinking without fear of being viewed in any kind of particular way. Let's try to be honest with each other about that. And then the last thing is let's love the word dialogue that Gail used before, right? Let's have a dialogue, not a debate. Let's do our best to try to not kind of criticize decisions that parents or the kids or folks in the community made in the film. Let's try to do our best to understand how they made their decisions, why they made their decisions, and the things that they were doing. I think that will produce a much more productive dialogue that we'll have here. Can we agree to those three things? Everybody good with that? All right. So I think, did you want to start with any kind of initial thoughts or comments that you had, Carol?
Thank you, Kariga. And I also want to thank everyone for being here. And I feel quite humbled to have been asked to be here and share, and to also be with my fine friend, Kariga Roush, who I'm continually learning from. But let me share with you that, as Gail indicated, I'm a lifelong educator. I actually retired in 2005. However, I'm out here doing everything that I can to help continue to make a difference, because once you're a passionate educator, it never leaves you. It's all in your system to do what you can for all children. So that's what I try to do, is advocate for all children. So I appreciate being asked to be here. I feel very emotional. Do you? I feel very, very, when I watch this, and I've watched it before, and I just tear up. I tear up as an educator, as a mom, as a grandmother, and as a community stakeholder, because the whole issue of working with our children is emotional, and I think we have to acknowledge that. I think it's okay to acknowledge that in dialogue. It allows the dialogue to be much richer, and it allows it to be authentic, because we can relate that well. I want to also share with something with you. Last night, I attended the second annual honors program at Tech High School for the top 25 students. And I attended also last year. And it is so moving, it is so telling, because the students are allowed to get up and share their most memorable moments, their personal statements, as well as honor the educator that has meant so much to them. And this is one of the first times I've seen this done in urban school, and Tech High School has 2,000 students. But I want to share with you, and see, they have a very polished book and fine pictures of each of the students. The whole setting of the cafeteria was no different from the finest dining hall that you would go to, with tables skirted, the chairs skirted, beautiful flowers, and this was all done by their alumni. And why is that ambiance important? Because it says to the students and the families how we value you, and you are no different from any private school. But what was so noted, I'm gonna cry, but anyway, as each of these students came up and talked so eloquently with their 4 points, and now you can get more than a 4 point. So they have 4.23s. As they talked so eloquently, no different than any child, I guarantee you, going to any other school, whether it's private, charter, whatever, religious school, and talked about their experiences. And as Kariga knows, and some of you know, when they said what was so memorable and admirable about their best teacher, and most of the teachers happened to be math teachers. I was a science teacher, but they had some math teachers and science teachers and some career technology teachers. But they didn't talk about how they really got me to understand the square root. They talked about what a difference they made in my life and how they became like a mom to me, a dad to me, and one said a sister to me, how they listened to me, how they came into me, how they touched me, how they stayed with me, over the 4 years. Sometimes they didn't stay in the same class, didn't have that teacher, but the teacher still stayed with them and followed up with them. So you have to stop and think, what makes this difference? And through here, it went across race. So you had black children that their favorite teacher was a white teacher, and you would have vice versa. But it all was someone who cared about me. There was one young man whose mother committed suicide, and that teacher came right to their rescue. There was one boy whose brother died, and again, the teacher came to their rescue. So I just want to open it up with what makes the difference.
And I'm so glad, as we kind of throw the first question out for folks to respond to, that Carol's perspective on what makes a difference. What I find to be fascinating about this film is that, first, oftentimes we talk about challenges that African American and Latino, but especially African American students face, and it's almost always African American kids in poverty, right? And it's pretty easy sometimes. We have kind of good language around kids in poverty and the challenges of their communities and those kind of things. This film was about 2 middle-class African American boys, right? That are still having similar challenges that black boys in lower income communities also experience. So, this is about race in this context. It's not about poverty necessarily. Not saying that those issues aren't important, but for the purpose of this film, we have to kind of take out our poverty conversation, right, and talk about the difficult thing of race, because that is something that's very unique here. So I think to throw it out to the audience and to start a good dialogue is, let's just start with what were there parts of the film, what parts of the film that you've seen so far that were particularly troubling, particularly inspiring, or particularly kind of stuck with you that you'd just like to share?
I want to throw something out then. What did you notice about the children, the boys in the earliest years? Let's start with the earliest years.
Just the fact when they were young, they were happy and full of ambition and, didn't have all that pressure and anxiety. And then as the years progressed, just the pressure and anxiety just kept, toppling on top of each other. And then, I guess if I go on, I'm not really answering the question anymore. No, but my big thing was just the fact that we didn't get a lot of tape of the teachers talking, but a little bit we had, they didn't seem very supportive. And I think that tied into the kind of self-fulfilling prophecy for the kids at times, that they were capable and the teacher didn't take time to maybe there's some things going on that were outside of the academic world that they were having troubles with, because they were both bright. So I think that lack of support just perpetuated that anxiety and pressure.
Mm. I think it's interesting that you say that as we get the mic to some other folks. I think I saw a hand back here. Interesting that you say that. Carol, excellent observation. When they were young, happy just like everybody else, right? And then Shayon, and I do think it's interesting, his name is pronounced Shayon. If you listen to some of his teachers, they pronounced it Sean, right? Little things like that matter, actually. By 6th grade, what did he say? I hate school. You know, we have some literature that suggests, especially for African American students, about 4th, 5th, or 6th grade, that there's something different starts to happen with them developmentally, in their identity development, where they start to recognize what it means to be an African American person in whatever context they're in. And that's when you start to see disengagement and a whole lot of other things start to happen around that age. Yeah.
That's kind of what I had noted as well, that when they interviewed when they were younger, they said there was really no difference. They didn't see themselves different than their white peers. But by 7th grade, the quote I wrote down was, "Wouldn't it be better if I were white?" Mm-hmm. So from the age, how it kind of, he started to realize that, you know, he was different or seen as different.
It's also really interesting in that conversation, when Idris was having a conversation with his mom and dad, right, about wouldn't it be better or easier, right, if I were white? A lot of conversations there, right? But I think the nuance of that was also within a conversation about girls. And about him not wanting to, necessarily go to a dance. He said he's been to many of these, right? And they come to this part where, the boys have danced with the girls. And what did he say? The girls always say no.
So one of the things that I noted that was, to your question, early on the mom was talking about how her son, when they met together, that her son came into the school doing very well in math. And since he had been at the school, he had just continued to go downward. I think one of the troubling things to me about that is when they interviewed both a teacher and the school leader, they both acknowledged that there is an issue, especially as it results in African American males, but none of them or neither of them had any solutions to the issue. And I think as educators, as people in the community, as parents, as just people in general, it's not good enough anymore just to recognize that there's a problem. We have to be able to work together to figure out, one, what the problem is, and two, how should that problem be addressed? Because to know that it's there
Exactly.
doesn't do anything to address it or to solve it.
Very good comment. Very good comment. With the words that are used, did you notice the descriptors? You used the word bright in the early years, and if you pay attention to those descriptors, also curious. And when I do my training on cultural competence, one of the things that we discuss is we discuss terms that are used. And what do they mean when you say bright? And what does that mean if we only say it for certain children and we don't say it for all children? What does that say about the other children? Just something to think about. And if we note that children are so curious at such an early age, and then with your point, as time goes on, we don't hear about that curiosity. And could that have anything to do with what we promote in our schools? And I'm a former principal. For 9 years, I was a middle school principal in IPS. And one of the things that comes through this film is that there's a disconnect between the curiosity and the fun and the play and what happens in terms of our curriculum and our instruction. But also there's another piece when they mentioned about he's only interested in hip hop. Well, what does that say to a black child or any child who starts to be interested in hip hop? What does that say?
And so John had a comment, so you can get a microphone to him, but as that's coming to your point, and this is where I think it gets kind of nuanced and hard and messy, right? Where you talk about, identifying a problem, not having solutions. Well, one of Dalton's solutions was the after-school tutoring program, remember? And, on its face, I can see a school kind of saying, this is a good thing, right? We want to provide an extra opportunity for kids to get more support, to get more resources, to get, extra help. What does it mean when the only kids that are in that are black? I mean, but that's where it gets hard and where it gets messy, right? Because we do want for all of our kids to have the kind of support they need to be successful. And in some cases, perhaps that does mean extra help. But is it the institution's responsibility to also look and say, okay, we're offering this help, but we're only requiring certain kids to go? What does that mean, John?
Well, to that point, I think what it points to the stratification, because other folks were buying tutors
Yes,
from the
right.
Was it
outside.
$30,000
That's
a
right.
year? That's
So
still.
I think that was
That's right.
which sort of reinforced the stratification that took place. The comment I was going to make was the tremendous weight of expectations. That word was spoken over and over again by parents, by teachers and administrators, though I never heard any of the young people say anything about expectation. But they're the ones who felt that tremendous weight of trying to measure up to some standards that maybe they weren't even privy to knowing what those standards were. And I don't know if that's a special weight on young black men who feel that even greater expectation that they have to succeed on behalf of everybody else.
So let me get real personal as we, get some more comments here. My father, at a very young age, told me multiple times, Kariga, you can't be as good as everybody else. You have to be better than everybody else, because the way that this world is going to look at you is if you are doing as well as everybody else, they'll see you as less than. You have to be exceptional because you are African American in this context. And there are a lot of black families, not all, but a lot of black families that, pass those messages on. Right. Now, is that a burden I should have had to have carried in my life? No. But I did. The expectations and the pressure that creates, especially for young kids, it's real. It's hard. It's hard when you just want to be another kid. Right. All right, when you just want to fit in, when you just want to go and ask a girl to dance with you and she says yes, right? When you just want to not have to do all the extra stuff that everybody else, has $30,000 extra dollars to do that you don't have, right? Those burdens, those expectations, both from the school and from the home, right? Again, not being critical, right, of them or even of my parents. I think reflecting, they had to do that. Yeah. They had to do that for me because I believe they were right in that context, but still hard. Mm-hmm. Say another hand. Okay, well, one other thing to kind of throw out for a discussion. I'm particularly struck by the difficult decisions that the black families and the parents had to make, right, in this, right, so for those of you who don't know, right, Dalton is considered one of the most premier schools in the city, right? If you get into Dalton, you go to Dalton, right, you're set, right? That's it. And the truth is, because I talked to a few people after reviewing this film about a month ago, that indeed, if you have Dalton on your diploma, that matters for college universities, right? You'll see a little bit later, not always, but those kind of things, right, that matters to a lot of folks. The unique burden that these families had to think about, though, is what does being in a place like that mean psychologically and socially for my son as a black student there? And I think it is important to state the obvious that it is about race for them, right? It's not just about kind of typical developmental things that all kids kind of go through that time. Right, they're going through a lot of the same things, but for them, there was a unique pressure, a unique kind of experience that those families had to think deeply about. Is this the right place for my kid? I mean, yes, they're getting an education that compared to some other places is a lot better, and having a diploma, or in the kind of learning is going to be helpful for them long term. And Shayon's mom I thought was very interesting early on, right, when she said, I want for my son to know, I think not exactly, but I want for my son to know how to work with white people because I'm still not comfortable around them.
Right. Was that a surprising statement for any of you?
Seeing a lot of no's.
You know, when we look at the graduation rates of African Americans and other minority groups in white institutions, and some of the reasons for that have to do with the cultural mismatch and the lack of appropriate resources to support that. One African American girl that I mentored that came from an all-black high school, when she went away to IU Bloomington and she contacted me right away, she said, "Miss Craig, I didn't know there were so many white people in the world."
Yeah.
You know, and I had to laugh because you think about your world. What is your world? And your world mostly is your home and your neighborhood and your church, you know, your community center, your barbershop, your beauty shop, and then you come out into a different world.
That's right. So let me throw this out to folks. But we want integrated schools.
That's right.
Right? I mean,
Yes.
we want schools that have kind of different races of kids and people. Don't we? Anybody want to disagree with that? I'm asking, this is a very intentionally provocative question, actually. And I'm not sure there
Jim
is
has a
simple
comment.
answer to that.
It's not just integrated schools, it's integrated teachers.
Okay, I was going to comment
Because
on that.
something like 84% of America's public school teachers are white women.
In Indiana, only 3% of the teachers are in the category minority teachers, 3%. And the teachers that we do have here in Indiana, any of you teachers, they're coming from small towns. So you've got a double culture. You've got the geographic culture mismatch as well as the culture mismatch with regard to ethnicity.
To speak to your point and to your question, for me, I went to a high school that was 70% Caucasian, 30% African American. Then I went to an all historically black college and university. So when I got there, I never saw so many black people. So when he talked about the teachers in the program, I just kept thinking of just a loss of identity and them not knowing who they are, and just a loss of, and I feel like I found that when I went to an historically black college and university, because my teachers, I had one black teacher my whole high school career.
I just kind of wanted to piggyback off of that because we share that same experience. I grew up in Indianapolis, went to primarily all white schools, went to an African American, an HBCU, historically black college or university. But on top of that, it was also same gender. So I went to an all female college. So to go there and come to that realization of, for me, it wasn't necessarily, oh, there's so many black people, but my realization was, oh, there's so many educated black people, because like you in high school, there was one African-American male teacher. He was a math teacher, but I never had him for math. So I knew him to be in the building, but I never had the opportunity to kind of interact with him. So to then go onto a campus where so many African-Americans held doctorate degrees was very enlightening for me. And it set me on a different path.
I just wanted to make a comment. I always have hope. You can tell looking at me, I've had hope for a long time. But one thing that I really just came home to me in the last 2 weeks, Light of the World had a special program, and I think it was 5 African American superintendents of public schools. And then I heard the superintendent from Fort Wayne, who was also an African American. And I was just thinking, wow, at last, our children can really look beyond, and especially, and I know 2 of these people especially are making that point to go down and say, hey, you know, how are you doing? Here I am. This is a great connection. So I've been working at this for a long, long time. I integrated schools in Galveston, Texas. We worked very hard to put people together who will eventually maybe live next door to each other. And it's difficult, but Galveston was an island, and they did succeed, but it was difficult.
So I want to push us just a little bit here, before we get some lunch and other things, because I intentionally asked a question about integrated schools, and I'm glad you brought up the point about teachers and relationships, as Carol talked about before, and how those things matter. Usually, when we talk about integrated schools, that to many of us is code for we want for black kids to go to white schools predominantly and lose all of who they are as a part of that process. Essentially, a lot of what like Dalton looks like, right? Because they were fairly integrated. I believe some of the data, about 30% or so were kids of color, at Dalton. Not necessarily integrated, but I believe there was some data that said about a third, right? So that's, not half and half, but, enough that they're not tokens necessarily. Well, except by grade level. Different conversation, right? But that's usually what integration, means. And I think that's why, and we'll see a little bit of this in the next part of the film, why there are some folks who are intentionally, going to HBCUs, right? Or are looking for other contexts or environments where, I don't know if the education is going to be as good. I don't even know what that means anymore, what a good education is. That's a different conversation. But at least I know I can have my son someplace where he's safe, psychologically, socially, emotionally, right? He's safe. He doesn't have to worry about what it means to be one of two black kids in his class, like Shayon and Idris, had to. Those are complicated, thorny, tough conversations when, especially, so I have two girls, so I don't have a son. And my wife's name is Michelle. I tell you that because she frequently tells me, yes, if the President of the United States and I have a wife named Michelle and two daughters, so can you. So we're done with any more kids. But I've got, my two daughters named the 6-year-old, right? And, I can tell you my family, we talk about that and struggle with those kind of questions with daughters. It's even, I think, even more magnified with sons, right? And that is something that is, that I think all of us had to have an appreciation. That's not a question, the type of questions that black families have to ask themselves in making those decisions are sometimes different than other families, right? When we think about, the right context for kids, there are a lot of general questions that all of us have to answer. But there's also some unique questions I think this film brings out that African American families have to deal with and address.
I would have to agree with that. I attended school for a while in Canton, Mississippi. And I knew better than to develop any kind of like for a white girl because you might get castrated or hung. But a couple befriended my friend and I when they tried to integrate. We was going to the country school, Velma Jackson, and they took us to start busing us in. And because of that friendship, they stopped busing us in. And he came to our school and told them about we was in danger just by talking. Because we happened to, sit in close proximity and became good friends. I think a lot of these decisions is forced upon the black family. We're not, we have to remember that. And then I've had good experiences where I never forget in the 3rd grade, I went to school with a hole in my shirt. And the teacher called me, and it was school 12 at that time on West and McCarty, and gave me a better shirt before my classmates saw it. And when I was at LA City College, a white teacher, Jeannie, she encouraged me to get out of acting and study human services. And then at Cal State Dominguez Hill, Dr. Palmer encouraged me to go into social work. So I've seen that piece, both sides of it. But one of the most troubling things is when it happened to your children. I got my son, he was playing on the Dynamo team, soccer team. He was much better than the players, but he couldn't even hardly get playing time. Then we put him in Brebeuf, and they called for a meeting, was expelling him from school. And we got there, and the teacher and the dean went back to get the proof why they was expelling him. Then they come back and told us, and I had the Urban League with me. So, well, it wasn't your son, it was another boy. And the social worker had nerve enough to tell me, so, well, we can tell by the way he walked down the hall, he has a learning disability. Now, she didn't know I was in the MSW program at IU at the time. And then recently, you know, my wife encouraged, I was against it. I wanted my daughter to go to a black college. She sent my daughter to Grand Rapids, Calvin College. We went and visited. It seemed to be a nice college, very Dutch oriented. When she came home for Thanksgiving, she had an eating disorder because her white friends who she liked had convinced her that she was too big and certain things, and she wasn't. She was in good shape. And as I don't even comment sometimes, I talk to her and she talk about the things that, and she was in the dorm. It was only 2 black people in this whole dorm. And her white friends wanted to have relations, you know, be friends with them, but their upbringing and the things, they was insulting her all the time. And she was studying trying to assimilate into a culture that wasn't accepting her. Even, you know, she talked about how they tried to talk black, but they couldn't talk, you know.
Like
Things they would say trying to befriend her was offending her. So we have to really look at the holistic picture of we putting our kids in an environment where their parents and society has conditioned them to such that it's going to make their life harder. And so as we deal with these problems, we have to also look at what's causing the problem. You know, we have to look at what's causing the problem, because these things, and my parents told me the same thing, and I saw it, that I had to, if I wanted a B, I had to work hard to get an A. And then I had one professor at IU School of Social Work to tell me, I went and talked to him. He said, yeah, I should have given you a B, but I gave you a C. I'll change it. He admitted, you know, but he didn't say why, but I was sitting there feeling like a why. So these things are very real. They're hurtful. I still get emotion when I think about not necessarily how they did me, and this happened in and out of school, but, you know, but how they deal with my children now. There's no way my daughter went to that fine college up there. She'll come home with an eating disorder because of the pressure that the people there put on her about what she was eating. You know, we were trying to figure out, why are you losing all this weight? And she was trying to satisfy their opinion of what a young lady should look like and what size they should be like.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic. In my experience, I grew up as a military brat, and so coming up in that environment, everybody's dad wore green, and it's amazing how much the military is a great equalizer with regards to race and everything else. I mean, it's. I really didn't come into any racial issues in my school years until I was in high school. And that's when we moved here from Germany, I think it was. And my dad retired, and it was my first time really coming to a non-military facility, a non-military school, and walked into class at Lawrence Central with the only person I had met up to that point, which was another young man, a white kid that was down the street from. He and I made friends on the bus, and we walked into the school together and sat down looked at lunch and said, okay, now where am I supposed to sit? Because half of the cafeteria was, you know, the black kids were sitting on one side, the white kids were sitting on the other, and the two of us are sitting there as friends going, well, where do I go? Because I had never been exposed to any of that. So that was an eye-opener to me. And so through that, then I began my own journey, to your point, of trying to understand my culture and try to understand, well, where is some of this anger coming from? Because I never really felt the need to. I felt comfortable in my skin. I was comfortable in my surroundings. I could make friends with about anybody, you know. So I had no perception of what it meant to not like someone for the color of their skin, or the food they ate, or whatever, you know. Pick the thing. To me, people were people. But once I moved into the regular society, non-military society, it was eye-opening. It was eye-opening. So to this day, with my own children, to your point, we spend a lot of time having the same discussions about pressures you're likely to come across, or maybe being more tolerant. You know, it kind of goes both ways, right? So it's an interesting dynamic. I'm really glad to see this going on. No, thank you.
Yes.
Hi. I know we're pressed for time, but I just wanted
all
to
right.
shout out one comment. I think the issues that we see in the video and that we're hearing from these two last gentlemen is that the issue really is an identity crisis. I think from an early age, since we are born, we are systematically conditioned to be a certain way, to act a certain way, to look a certain way. And especially for our young African American youth, it's even more of a crisis because they fall into this stigma of, oh, I'm not good enough and I don't have what it takes because of what they're seeing and what they're being told from teachers, coaches, even their parents in their own household. They're told how to be a certain way, and that way isn't good enough for them. So I think what it comes down to is that the best way to reach these kids and to get them motivated and is the example that you gave earlier, is just to show our youth how much that we care. I mean, they don't care how much we know, they just want to know how much we care. And I think that's, in my own experience, because I grew up with very, very low self-esteem. One, because I suffer with a bad stutter. And two, because
Get out of here.
I do. Some days are better than others, but I do. And it wasn't until those teachers, coaches, and adults that reached back and invested their time and their money in me that I found confidence in myself, and that affected my grades, affected my relationships, affected everything. And I think the issue or the solution is to show how much we care, and it's up to us.
Yes. I appreciate you sharing that. Is Derek? Derek. Thank you so much. You mentioned the identity. There's the whole subject of racial identity, and that usually is missing in teacher education. For teachers, they usually have one course on cultural competency, or it may be integrated, depends on the university, into their other coursework. But the whole subject of racial identity and working with our children, knowing how to work with our children to assist and honor their race and the stages of racial identity, because there's stages that a child will go through in terms of identifying with the race and then pulling back at times and then later coming back. I've watched it with my children and my grandchildren, but it's such a key.
Not to interrupt, but and the important part of what Carol's talking about, racial identity development, is every child.
Every child
goes
has
through
that, white,
right?
black,
every
Latino.
child has a race, and that's I think a very
Right.
important point.
And I think one thing before we go to break is we want to be sure that we acknowledge race, acknowledge it. We've come through an era where it was okay to be colorblind. And the teachers were taught to say, I teach all children, I love all children, I don't notice their race, because that was the acceptable
Well said.
context at the time. But now we're finding out that is a disservice to every child to say that I don't notice who you are and the beauty of who you are, your ancestry, your culture, your strengths that you bring with you.
How are we feeling? It's okay to feel a lot of ways right now. Anybody want to share?
Obviously, those young men and their families went through so much in a short period of time. There were the highs and the lows, and it was great to see that each of them now is on a road that they want to be on. They're both excited about their where they are, but there's a sort of regret that they had to go through the difficulties they had to go through in order to get there, and maybe some of those could have been alleviated. Some of them as part of life. We do have loss and we do have trauma, but there were probably barriers and obstacles there that could have been alleviated by something or someone.
Who else wants to just share kind of your, please.
Over here. I got a little teary-eyed watching it, and then I started to think, well, what is it that I'm really crying for? What are the tears for? And it was almost like for every success that they achieved, that was one less failure that they had to see or go through. And so for that was good. But then I also could not help thinking about these two young men that have both parents that are 100% in their corner. And the reality I think that a lot of people face, the majority of our students face, is that many of them don't have that. So what is it that's going to give them that resiliency or the perseverance to kind of push through, and it continues to come back to having people both in and out of the school that really care, whether that is a parent or whether that's a mentor or a teacher or a principal or whatever role that person might occupy, but just, each young person having somebody that's willing to go the distance for them.
Mm-hmm. So to that point, I don't know if she was a psychologist or a counselor or somebody else at Banneker, where, Shea, at special ed. I found her role to be really interesting in this film. What did you notice about her that struck you? There were a few things that she did and she said that I thought were particularly interesting.
One of the things that credentialed her for me, I think, is that she did acknowledge that he did not always live up to his full potential. Mm-hmm. But that did not stop her from believing in him, from continuing to push him, to celebrate him when she could. When he got accepted, she made sure that to ask him, had you gone to the person, their college person, I'm assuming, that puts him on the Wall of Fame. She, made sure that all of those opportunities to celebrate him was there. But when he needed the support, when he lost his brother, she seemed to be that person that he would come to and be understanding. But at the same time, she pushed and acknowledged when he didn't do what he needed to do.
In a lot of our kind of school and psychological and racial identity development literature and parenting literature, what I noticed to her is what's called warm demandingness, right? This idea that there was an affection that she had for him. You could tell, right? She knew him, she cared about him. Notice what she called him and what some other teachers at Banneker called him. Called him Shea, which is what his mom called him, right? Now, it may seem little, but it's actually not, right? We can contrast that with what we saw early in at least the French teacher who called him Sean, which wasn't his name at all, right? And to your point, which I think is really important, right? She was there for him to go and sleep after his brother passed away for a couple of periods, right? That warmth, but the demandingness that you're pointing out, where she also wasn't enough just to gave him some space to let him exist, right? Let him feel, let him do what he needed to do, but she wasn't going to let him off the hook either. It's kind of interesting, the important roles that even somebody who isn't a classroom teacher, who isn't a principal, who isn't a parent, because in this case, I would argue, I can't imagine what Sheon's parents must have been going through during that time. But there was somebody in his life. There was somebody in his life that knew him well enough to give him what he needed. What other thoughts or reactions do folks have?
I think they both had that period of grief. It was a different type of grief. Sheon went through his grief with the loss of his brother, whereas Idris was going through the grief of the disappointment that he had, because I don't know this for sure, but it felt like he had failed his parents. You know, he didn't get into these great big fancy colleges or universities, even though he got into 3 different very good schools. But I think there was that sort of grief that he was going through that somehow he disappointed his parents and maybe disappointed himself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way they portrayed that with the context of current events, with Obama's election and then with the Trayvon shooting, and you see how that hopefulness, almost he's a little cocky when he's at the Stanford tour, right? Of course they'll accept me. And then you see a very different reality kind of disrupt those expectations and those dreams. And so I think that the way that they framed that with those little bits and even that shot of the different magazines was really clever because it brings a whole different context to the story.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. Did you notice the language that he used when he was at Stanford, right? And he really wanted to go there. I thought his use of language was particularly interesting, where he said, "How could they reject me?" I also found it really interesting that you could tell his parents were also pretty disappointed, right? So I think John brought up a good point, in that. Again, not to, cast judgment or anything like that. I also did find it interesting that after I think they all went through, kind of that heartache, what did his parents do? His dad came in and told him what in his room?
He said that even though that we're disappointed, we're not disappointed in you.
In you.
And that was powerful, and he needed that.
Yeah.
And I think that's what lifted him up.
Mm-hmm. Another example of an adult in a critical time in a young black man's life where he may need somebody to intervene in how he's feeling and lift him up at that point in time. To your point, not all of our sons have that. Other big thoughts that folks have kind of walking away from this. Let's spend just a couple more minutes. Please.
I thought it was interesting when the one young man was asked, "How did you feel about the president being elected?" He said, "I didn't feel any different." I thought that was very revealing.
Yeah, I just made the comment, and then think about the story that his dad told in that moment.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a generational difference, I think. And I do think it's interesting how his dad responded to that. Didn't necessarily tell him that his response was bad or good, but explained why it would matter to him. And you could tell he was listening pretty closely, to that. So, in the last couple minutes that we have, what do we do? How is this impacted either the way that you think or things that you're going to do or engage? Now, we don't need any, kind of big revelations, right? Or I'm going to go and, change my whole life. That would be great, but that's not, the kind of intention of the question, right? And I say that very intentionally because oftentimes we are so focused on, well, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? I think for me, what this film has done has said, before you jump into what we do, you need to understand what is, because that's going to inform what we do. Without an understanding of what these 2 black families have had to experience with their sons, without an understanding of the experiences these 2, young black males have had in their schooling career, we may do a lot of stuff and may be wrong, maybe counterproductive. Right? It's. I think somebody, Darren, right, said early on, and I'll leave this as the last question, and then see if anyone wants to respond to it. It's about knowing, caring, and being demanding, right, all at the same time of kids, especially of our young black kids, our sons. I'd push us to think that it's also about knowing somebody well enough to know how they need to be cared for, right? I come from a particular context and culture, right, and set of expectations and experiences where, with my mother and father and my sisters, right, we know each other well enough where I know how to love them. You have to get to know somebody well enough to know how they need to be loved, to know how to stand in the gap. It's not enough, I think, just to say, I'm going to give you a hug. You're going to be all right. in some cases that's good and important, right? But if you don't know where they're coming from, that may ring hollow. We were having a conversation earlier, Darren and a few of us over here about, just the importance of taking time to really getting to know these boys. Any last thoughts before we wrap up?
Something that I'm definitely going to take away from this film is that question of loss of identity. And I thought it was really interesting when we entered the discussion, you say we have all this language and framework surrounding racial issues and poverty, but we're taking that poverty language out of the frame. And so when we're talking about this specific situation, seeing how if you aren't essentially assimilated into that school, they're quick to call it not a good fit. And there's such a lack of resources at an institutional level, but for different resources for identity and for feelings of community. And so to see that in the framework of their lives, but then to think about how you can implement those resources or access to those resources to really encourage cultural competency in all levels, in all different demographics, I think is just such a really important takeaway point from the film for me.
Terrific. The last thing that I'll say, and then we'll wrap up. Did you have something that you wanted to? I saw a hand come up right here. Please.
Just to add to her point, I look at it as acculturation versus assimilation, and bringing in those stakeholders from the community, the parents, and involving them in that conversation to get to know those students that we're talking about and what we can do to help.
Well said. I would also encourage all of us, irrespective of your political persuasion, to pay attention to what President Obama announced earlier this week, the My Brother's Keeper initiative, which is very intentionally designed to bring philanthropy, education, government, and not-for-profit organizations together to very specifically focus on how we can elevate the academic and life chances of our young boys and men of color. So I encourage us to pay attention to that. What I think they've got right in this is that it's probably not establishing a bunch of new programs. It's finding those programs that do work and helping to scale those to some degree. And it's also I appreciate what the president said about it's not necessarily about programs, it's about programs that produce relationships and meaningful relationships. So with that, I'll let Gail wrap us up. Before we do that, I'll just say it has been my honor to be with you during this conversation and very much appreciate the dialogue, very much appreciate the honesty, the openness, and the authenticity to be willing to be touched, by these kids' lives, because these two boys are not atypical from a lot of our sons and their experiences. So by simply watching this, we now have, I think, a greater understanding of what a lot of our young boys and men of color have to go through, and ways to make their lives better.
Kariga, once again, thank you, and thank you to all of you for what you do every day on behalf of children and young people in this community. Have a great day, and thanks.